Zooming Out speaker series. We have curated this series to really help us all to better understand the context and the environments that influence our work and allow us to collectively discover ways to change based on what we're learning, based on what all of the speakers are sharing. And so today, we are very excited for this session on systems change, where we're going to explore why systems thinking is a critical component of advancing a primary prevention ecosystem in the US, and specifically how to understand and transform the system conditions that we know contribute to the social problems like child abuse and neglect in ways that go beyond programmatic thinking. The prevention field in our country to date has not adequately addressed the systemic issues and inequities that are contributing to negative childhood outcomes. And as a result, most of our prevention strategies have often been designed and geared towards individual behaviors and perpetuate this notion and this idea that child abuse and neglect is largely an individual family issue that's void of any systemic factors, which we know is not true. So propelling the field of primary prevention forward really requires us to deeply partner with one another, to challenge our long-held beliefs about prevention systems and services, to experiment and rapidly test new ideas, measure progress in real time, and launch and advocate for policies, for structures, and for budgets that truly create more equitable, meaningful, and effective systems change. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today for our session. First is Mark Cabaj, who is the president of From Here to There Consulting and an associate of Tamarack, which is an institute for community engagement. Mark's current focus is on developing practical ways to understand and plan and evaluate efforts to address complex issues, including addressing the systemic roots of underlying issues related to poverty and to homelessness and community safety, educational achievement, health, and climate change. Mark is particularly interested and involved in developing and promoting developmental evaluation, which is a new approach to assessment which emphasizes real-time feedback and learning, what we did for our theory of change and our adaptive strategy process, but really allowing the learning in this emerging, messy, and often fast-moving environments. I had the privilege and the pleasure of first meeting Mark about 10 years ago when together we were leading an international systems change effort called the Change in Mind Initiative. He's brilliant, he's funny, and he's just an all-around great guy. So we're so excited to have Mark here with us today. Next is Erin Watson, who is the owner of Weaving Change and has extensive experience in the use of systems thinking and participatory action learning to design, implement, and evaluate transformative change efforts that are aimed at promoting equitable outcomes for all kids and families. A lot of you know Erin. A lot of you on the call know Erin. She's been working closely with the PCA America team for the past 3 years on our adaptive strategy process and the development of our theory of change for primary prevention in the US. We will have time at the end of Erin and Mark's presentations to allow for discussion and questions and answers. And so Mark and Erin, thank you again so much for joining us today. We're so excited. I'm so excited for this session. And I'll now turn it over to Erin.
All right. Well, to start us out, I have a question for you, which is, what is your emotional response to the phrase systems change? So there's a code there. You can use your phone or in the chat. Let me bring the chat up again real quick. There's that website. If you see if I can get this back up. if you go to that website and click in, oh, there it is. Okay. Click in there's the website in the chat. If you go to that, it's going to give you an option to put in a couple words that represent your emotional response to systems change. So as you do it, I'm going to actually show this on the other screen so we can see it emerge. This is always kind of fun. So here's what people are saying their emotional response to systems changes. Take about 10 more seconds. This is always kind of interesting to see where we're starting from. All right, so as you can see, there's a big variation. Some people are hopeful and excited. Some people are overwhelmed and fearful and even uncertain, frustration, motivated. There's lots of different types of emotions. And that's normal because the systems field has not always done a great job in describing these things in ways that are actionable and can resonate with people's everyday experience. So my goal today is to try to change that. And Mark and I are both going to try to describe this in a way that's fun and meaningful so that we can all use this for our practice. So why should we care about this? I think Karen Pittman sums it up really well in this quote. Programmatic interventions help people beat the odds. Systemic interventions seek to change the odds. How does that quote affect you? I know I kind of get like goosebumps when I read it because it really sums up like why we care about this and why we're all working so hard. It reminds us that programs are necessary and essential, but at the end of the day, they're really insufficient to create the big types of changes that we see we need to help kids change the odds. And so that's why we're talking about this today. You mentioned a lot of examples of systems change in the chat. I'll be bringing that up and Mark will too. So here is the theory of change that Jen was alluding to. You've all probably seen this. We're really going to dive into this section of the theory of change around the primary prevention ecosystem, and there's those different leverage points, and really understand how are these things affecting those aspirations for children? How do we understand that and change it? Because at the end of the day, if we want to change ecosystems, first we need to understand what they are and how they're helping and hindering us, so that we can use that to guide really smart interventions. And so I'm going to start the session today talking about how do you understand systems and ecosystems, and then Mark is going to talk about how do you change them. So what is an ecosystem anyway? A common definition of a system or ecosystem is a group of interacting parts that function as a whole. So those things can be tangible, physical things that can be touched, people, organizations, money. They can also be intangible, beliefs, policies, goals. And at the end of the day, a system is basically a set of things, people, policies, beliefs, whatever, that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own patterns over time. And what we're talking about is a primary prevention ecosystem. So this is, again, a group of interacting parts functioning as a whole to advance well-being for children, youth, and families. And you'll note I'm using ecosystem and system kind of interchangeably here. Ecosystems aren't confined to any particular system that some people think about, like a child welfare system or health system. It encompasses all those things. And in my experience, sometimes using the word ecosystem helps people get over some of the baggage they have around the word system. But I'm going to use them interchangeably to mean what they mean here. So our theory of change from PCA America really is a call to action to build and improve these primary prevention ecosystems across the country. And there's a couple things you need to know. Your strategies, things like home visiting and policy advocacy and others, are part of that ecosystem, and they're affected by it. So think of all the things, parts of that system that affect how you do your work. Things like staff skills or external policies or shared mindsets and buy-in that might affect your ability to carry out your strategies. Your strategies are part of that ecosystem. So are your outcomes. Again, think of all the things in the broader system that affect your outcomes outside of your strategies. Housing policies, employer hiring policies, accessibility of green space, lots of things that might impact your outcomes. And I hate to say it, but we are also part of the ecosystem. You, your organization, your chapter, PCA America, are part of that primary prevention ecosystem. And again, can impact it and are impacted by that ecosystem. And so just kind of reflect that there's no avoiding this. We can't ignore it because we are all part of it. It's not going away. So how do we understand these ecosystems so we know how to change them and improve them for the better? I'm going to talk about 4 principles that are recognized by systems thinkers across the world as really critical to understanding these systems and ecosystems so that we can find better ways to change them. So I'm going to go through those. And at the end of my session, you're going to have a couple minutes just to kind of like brain dump this with a friend. We're going to put into breakout groups. So absorb this as the primary principles for how to understand ecosystems. So principle 1, I'm going to call boundaries. That's how people talk about it in the systems field. Boundary setting basically says which people, settings, sectors, and locations are going to be included in your system or ecosystem that you're focusing on, and which will be excluded. And why is that important? Because ideally, we would be able to focus on the universe as a system, but we're not quite there as a species, because the universe could technically be an ecosystem or a system. It's too big. So we have to make some decisions about what to focus on and what we want to try to influence. You got to remember that this idea of a system is just a mental model that we use to kind of make sense of the world, that there isn't one true system. And how we define these boundaries says more about our purpose than the purpose of the system itself. So if you look at where PCA America has moved in its theory of change, they looked at those aspirations for children and families on the left and thought through what is a potential ecosystem, primary prevention ecosystem that is relevant for those outcome areas. And here's where they have landed at this point. And you can see there's lots of cross-sector organizations, lots of types of families, lots of community entities, and different elected officials and policymakers. These are some of the individual sector settings that are relevant to address those outcomes on the left. So some people argue that this step of designing and delineating boundaries is one of the most critical steps of an effective change effort, because these boundaries have ethical implications, sorry guys, which perspectives are valued, what can be learned, where change is going to happen, where it's not going to happen, and ultimately who benefits from our interventions. So these boundaries are really important for us to take seriously and think through carefully. Here's some questions that others have used to help determine these boundaries. What problem or inequity should we be focused on? Out of all the ones we could, of all the people, settings, places we could focus on, which should we focus on for now, for our work now? Of all the places, where should we focus? And really thinking about who's engaged in those decisions, because again, they have such big implications on the work. So asking how might families and those with lived experience be engaged in defining these boundaries? So boundaries is the first principle. The second principle has to do with perspectives within those boundaries. So has anyone ever heard of the story of the blind man and the elephant? Got all these blind men looking at the elephant, different perspectives. So just like that story, systems thinkers have found that no one perspective can possibly understand all the parts of these complex systems and ecosystems we're trying to change. For example, leaders often have a good perspective on policy, but are pretty disconnected from access barriers that people encounter on the ground. Families, caregivers, service providers have a much better perspective of those access barriers. So this is why systems thinkers push us to think about multiple perspectives about these problems we're trying to change. So here are some perspectives that are commonly kind of accessed. They're really important to think about in your efforts. One is individuals with lived experience and direct service providers, like we just mentioned. They have a really good view of what's kind of going on the ground, often around access, around lived experience with different barriers. Leaders and funders, and community members. So there's lots of ways that you can access these types of perspectives. different types of methods you can engage. Many of you probably already have those, and then I'll talk about them in a second, some ideas. So if we're going to take a case example, let's say we're focused on equitable family financial stability. That's one of the aspirations in the theory of change. If we were part of a group who was focused on that problem area, here might be some perspectives a group would want to talk with, to engage, to understand an ecosystem related to that problem. You can see, you can easily start to brainstorm some of the critical people in an area who would have a good perspective on understanding what's going on. And you could ask those people questions through like existing meetings, putting questions on agenda items, through natural touches, finding things like play groups, service visits, waiting rooms to ask people their perspective on that problem to get that kind of broad perspective of what's going on. So, boundaries, perspectives. The third principle, given that those perspectives are seeing lots of different system parts, is understanding what's the interrelationships between everything going on in those ecosystems. So too often we look at like a policy or a program by itself, but understanding systems is all about examining how those things are affecting each other and other things. So if you remember that blind man and the elephant story, blind men were looking at that elephant was just in isolation. If you actually want to understand elephants, you got to think about how do they interact with each other? How do they interact in different contexts, even contexts they're not usually in? Unless you really think about them in interaction with other things, it's hard to really understand an elephant by just looking at one in isolation. And so you can think about the same thing related to our strategies. Here's an example logic model. Many of you might have this actually part of some of the things in your region around a program trying to improve positive parenting practices, safe, secure relationships. So while this logic model can help groups plan their program, it doesn't really show the broader system affecting that program and intended outcomes. Because if you would pluck one of those outcomes out and look at it, you could start to identify, gosh, there's a lot of other things that could be impacting that outcome, like stress experienced by caregivers due to financial security kind of barriers. Caregivers' employment and hours worked would definitely impact their financial security and their ability to use positive parenting practices with their kids. Their educational attainment would impact their employment and hours worked. Their health status would impact their jobs and their ability to use positive parenting. Some other family and regional narratives would impact that. Look at all these things that go way beyond the positive parenting program that logic model was contained to. And the idea is that by understanding these other factors, you can explore ways to simultaneously affect them in addition to the program by partnerships, by other kind of twofer type strategies. Because again, these things aren't going away. And unless we recognize them and take actions to address them, the outcomes we're trying to achieve are going to be a lot more difficult. In fact, there's groups that work through processes to literally like use sticky notes to map these things out to really have a broader view of how they might need to expand their thinking and partnerships to address those things. Okay. So this theory of change that Jen mentioned before is great because it gives us a little cheat sheet to try to understand some of these other factors, these other system parts that are impacting the outcomes and programs and strategies that we're all focused on. And so, anyone ever heard of a leverage point? Leverage points are basically things that if you change them, they can trigger lots of other changes across the ecosystem or system. And these leverage points can operate inside your chapter or organization or group, as well as outside. And so I'm just going to talk through briefly these different leverage points because I think they're extraordinarily helpful for picking out what might be some of the other parts of these ecosystems we work in that we need to pay attention to, and that we could start to design strategies and partnerships to be able to address. So there's 3 different buckets of leverage points in that theory of change. The first one is shared value for prevention. And one of the aspects of this are mindsets. So mindsets are beliefs, values, narratives, assumptions that create a way of viewing reality for people who hold them. And primary prevention ecosystems have shared mindsets in place that help advance those aspirations for children and families. So, for example, oftentimes in primary prevention ecosystems, cross-sector organizations may or may not believe that addressing those different types of aspirational outcomes, like family financial security, is relative and relevant for their own goals, which makes them more hesitant to engage in other partnerships. So the more people hold mindsets that view this as a larger well-being kind of issue, the more likely they are to be able to partner. So you can start to think about in your own ecosystem, what shared beliefs, attitudes, assumptions are helping and hindering the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and what's driving those outcomes or those mindsets. Goals is another thing within shared value for prevention. These are aims, outcomes, the purpose driving different organizations and groups. And again, in a primary prevention ecosystem, there are goals in place that help us all advance those aspirational outcomes, and those goals are aligned. So think about all the required goals and outcomes given to you by your funders and how those goals affect your decision-making, the policies you create, who you do and don't partner with, how you design your programs. And now think about whether those goals are helping or hindering your ability to achieve some of those aspirational outcomes in theory of change. Also think about goals in your ecosystem and to what extent they're aligned with what parents value and think are of high priority. These are all really important questions to think about to start to build a primary prevention ecosystem in your state and region. The next bucket of leverage points are, I'm calling structures, prevention structures. So this includes decision-making, how decisions are made, who is included, who's excluded, what information is used. Who would you think is the most commonly excluded group in most decision-making? Use the chat. What do you think? Yep, children, great. Who else is often excluded from decision-making? Parents, yep. Recipients, yep, of services. Perfect, you guys nailed it. So the reason why this is so critical, the fact that we can all easily say, yeah, they're excluded, is because research shows that primary prevention ecosystems are more likely to advance those outcomes when individuals with lived experience are engaged in decision-making with actual influence over decisions. Decisions about how to design programs, policies, hiring decisions. And this is often not the case in most of our communities across the country. And so this is a really important aspect of that primary prevention ecosystem that we can all be pulling into place. This also goes into how data and research is used in decision-making. Great question areas to explore in your own ecosystem. Okay, another thing in structures are policies and practices, formal and informal, procedures, protocols, laws, standards, norms. So again, a primary prevention ecosystem has policies and practices in place across multiple levels that advance those aspirational outcomes. And there's lots of policies that we can think of. Like think of for economic stability, you've got policies around paid parental leave, HR policies around hiring formerly incarcerated individuals. Lots of policies that we can think about. Those are often a key aspect of these ecosystems that need to be in place to help them advance those outcomes. The third one in structures are connections. This is how information, data, resources, referrals are exchanged between people and organizations. Primary prevention ecosystems have those connections in place that help advance those outcomes. So for example, families often talk about the need for communities to improve the way they refer families to resources and programs before they get into crisis. Unfortunately, that's often not in place within many communities. That's a critical piece of this primary prevention ecosystem that we can help to build and put in place. All right, the last category are resources. So this has to, the first element in this last category are family supports, opportunities, environments. This is the array, the accessibility, the quality of programs like home visiting, opportunities like living wage jobs, and environments like green space, playgrounds, broadband internet availability. So think in your own state or region, what barriers do families encounter when trying to access needed supports and opportunities and environments? Do some families encounter more inequities than others? We know there's a lot of inequities across these supports across the country. It's really important for us all to explore those, understand those, so we can change them and build a more effective primary prevention ecosystem. The last leverage point has to do with leaders and staff, their skills, their knowledge, their lived experience, who they are. And again, a primary prevention ecosystem has leaders and staff in place with the right skills and background to advance those aspirational outcomes. We know there's often massive staffing shortages across the country that impact our ecosystems, and that many staff and leaders don't always have the skills they need around trauma and brain science and community engagement. These are all really important areas for us to understand and in order to be able to build. So the idea here, takeaway, is as you look at this, think to yourself, of these different categories, which do you think research has found is most powerful for triggering other types of changes? Use the chat. As you look at these different leverage points, which ones do you think are most powerful? Yep. Sharon, Beth, you're on the right track. So basically what researchers have found is that the farther you move left on this screen, the more powerful these changes are for triggering lots of other changes. So it's kind of like throwing a big rock in a lake. Lots of ripples come out from it. So for example, if an organization adopts a new goal around advancing equity, what often happens is that organizations' internal policies, practices, partnerships automatically start to align themselves with achieving that goal. Or if an agency starts to authentically center families in their decision-making, it impacts what policies they adopt, who that agency partners with, how programs are designed. It kind of like has a big ripple effect. But that is not to say that the stuff in the prevention resources aren't important. Those things are critically important, but what we've learned is that when you change them, they have littler ripple effects, like a little pebble in a lake. And it takes a long time and energy to directly build those things. It takes time to train staff, to build parks, to fundraise money, to expand programs. It can be more strategic to shift the stuff on the left side of the screen that can automatically and sustainably bring about those elements. So, for example, passing something that requires new developers to add playgrounds and sidewalks to their designs so you don't have to build them one-on-one. Creating sustainable funding mechanisms to support needed programs, embedding skills into higher ed so that staff coming into your organizations already have the skills they need. So again, the main idea here is we need to start thinking about making changes across all of these different leverage points, because unfortunately, what research has shown is most of our attention is on the far right of the screen. That's what we're often funded to do. But we need to broaden and zoom out and realize that it's going to take changes in all of these areas to really move these and advance these aspirational outcomes. And we can start to understand a broader spectrum of things that are going on in the community by asking about these other leverage point areas. So brings us to the last dynamic, which is that even though it's important to understand all these leverage points, there's actually one other step, which is looking at how together they are creating kind of a larger storyline. So complex systems or ecosystems can really only be understood by looking down from like a balcony, basically, looking at whole patterns, not individual parts, because there's networks of these cause and effect kind of things going on that are leading to these big outcomes we see. So for example, think of smoking patterns and how those have changed over the last couple generations. So that huge system shift, that shift of pattern of smoking behavior, there was not like one thing that made that happen. It was a network of lots of interacting things that changed, that allowed smoking to shift. Policies, mindsets, partnerships, goals. Think of all the different things that changed over the last few decades that accumulated in that type of change. That's the type of like larger dynamic view that we're looking at. Oftentimes people take leverage those perspectives on these different leverage points in an ecosystem, pull up, zoom out, and develop a picture like this that shows how these different system parts, these leverage points, are interacting with each other and creating some larger kind of storylines for how our outcomes are being reinforced. In fact, there's even some things called system archetypes. They're like common storylines that can help you make sense of all these big dynamics of multiple interactions to kind of piece apart what's actually going on here and how do we disrupt some of the patterns that we're seeing. I think you can actually get a poster of this picture on the board if you're interested on your wall. But these can be really helpful for wading through all of kind of the detail that can happen when you're looking at that larger view. And when you now shift, this is beginning the transition to Mark. If you're attempting to shift and change these types of dynamical systems, the idea is you nudge and change and influence and incentivize the parts of this ecosystem and how they interact to basically work better for people and create better outcomes. And so you're prioritizing what are the most important leverage points in this larger view? How do we start shifting them, and then watch carefully over time to see what happens so you can be adaptive and continue nudging and incentivizing this ecosystem to work better for the people that we care about. All right, there's actually a TA guide that we're developing right now that has some ideas on how to do that, including a systems change strategy menu. We can share more on that later, but there's lots of support to help groups do exactly the types of things we've been talking about so far. So that was a lot. I wanted to provide a foundation, and this is what Mark likes to refer to as a relief valve moment. So we're going to go into a brief breakout session, just like with one or two other people, for you to think about, of all the ideas I just talked about, related to boundaries, perspectives, interrelated kind of system parts and those leverage points, and that larger view of the dynamics across the system. What kinds of ideas came alive for you today? What have you been motivated by? Have this moment just to kind of process some of that, and then we're going to go into Mark's session where he's going to talk about how now do you change ecosystems. So take it away, Kirsten.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And we're going to transition over and hear from Mark Cabaj.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. And thanks, Erin, for a first class and efficient introduction to some of the basic ideas about systems change. You have some resources at the end of your PowerPoint, which are really quite classic and useful. And I think people who read them will realize what a nice job you did summarizing the main points. So thanks for that, that framing. And Jennifer, thanks for the introduction. Everyone, I forgot if it was 10 years ago, Jennifer, but we had a lot of fun. We learned a lot, we laughed a lot, and we changed some things, I think, looking back upon those times. So it was very nice to be invited to contribute to your important work again. And Kirsten, Erin, it was fun prepping with you. Everyone, I am going to be building on some of the things that Erin said, and I'm doing it based on my own experiences. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, in Western Canada, close to Jasper. I don't know if you've heard that Jasper, a mountain park, went up in flames. That's very close to our place, where we spend a lot of time. And I think about systems change quite a bit in climate change for the most part, but also social development work. I used to be the vice president of the Tamarack Institute, and we did a lot of work in social innovation and multi-stakeholder processes. And as Jennifer knows, I think lots about the evaluation of systems change, which is really important because most traditional evaluation is designed to evaluate programs, not systems change. And we could have another entire call about this. A lot of the problems we have with evaluation is that they treat systems change evaluation like program evaluation on steroids. And it just doesn't work. So there's lots of work to do in that area. But I'm going to share, due to your team's bidding, some useful thoughts that I have seen about how to think about systems change. Erin confirmed the why of systems change and a little bit about what systems change are. There's so much good work out there about the how of systems change. I'm going to give you three visuals that each have an idea behind them that I find useful in this work, from planning, thinking, communicating, strategizing. And they have a lot of tactical implications, But once you hold the image in mind, I think it reveals it reveals some coherency that we all find helpful, and a number of ideas that may not be counterintuitive, but they are countercultural. And half the time systems change is a culture game more than anything. So with that in mind, I will show you the deck, which I understand you will all get. And confirm that I want to explore 3 ideas in 30 minutes. The idea of zooming out and zooming in iteratively over time, to zoom in on the work that you're doing and to zoom out and look at the systems that you're trying to change constantly without getting nauseous about it, like, like flying in a plane. This is a ridiculous title number 2, I know, but it'll make sense when we go through the point that not everyone has to play the oboe in systems change work. And the idea that I kind of find relaxing and almost therapeutic, and we need it, this idea of the enough versus feasible paradox. There's way more than things that we can talk about, but we decided that these 3 might be useful to explore. And I'm going to begin the first idea, which is the most lengthy of them, with a goofy story about, well, it's not goofy, it's important. It's about conserving parrots in St. Lucia. And I don't know how many people have been to St. Lucia, but they have a parrot there that no other island has. They call the parrot Jaquette. And in 1977, a conservationist found out there was only 100 of these parrots left. And so they panicked and they said, we need some kind of response to this. And they had some programmatic responses, but they also had a very big systems response. And that was to create a public policy framework that combined 2 ideas: the creation of conservation areas for Jaquette, and then a whole bunch of preservation measures about essentially leave Jaquette alone. Don't hunt him. Don't take down forests. Don't put him in your soup on a Sunday night when you're looking for dinner. Don't even, young boys, for the most part, use them as target practice. Right? Very, very practical. And it's a small enough island. So they created this. They thought they had a good chance. They created this policy package, and it fell on deaf ears. It was like driving a parked bus, because people said, well, we're busy. This isn't really an issue for us. So what did they have to do? They actually had to start working on culture and awareness and paradigms, by letting people know that not only was there a problem with declining numbers of Jaquette, but that they should give a rip about Jaquette because it was part of their island's identity. And this is sort of a social identity strategy often used in conservation now. It wasn't that big in the 70s. And what they essentially said is, if you're from St. Lucia, you should give a rip about this parrot. Only we have this parrot, right? And they put the parrot on buses. They put it in school programs. They made a little game. If you look at the bottom right, you have the American bald eagle and Jaquette, and they had a beauty contest on the radio. I don't know how you have a beauty contest on the radio, but they essentially said, hey, look at our national birds compared to other birds. And here's what they said. Hey, comparing Jaquette and the American bald eagle is like comparing Salma Hayek and Dick Cheney. Not even close. And they're playing games. You may not even like that game, but they're playing games. And what they're trying to do is to get a sense of identity with Jaquette. It's not just I'm aware of Jaquette. I have to give a rip about this issue. And you know how hard that is in a time and place where people are preoccupied with a million things. So awareness is one thing. Feeling the will and the commitment to do something is quite another. So actually what they did is they moved the needle on awareness, part of systems change and identity. And there was a lot of public pressure and support to do something about Jaquette. But while they were doing that, something else happened in the early 80s, and that was the rise of ecotourism, which is fairly mainstream now. But back then they were saying, hey, not only is it worth preserving Jaquette because we give a rip about the parrot, it is also probably could be part of the pillar of our ecotourism industry. So they created a new policy package, everyone, which was primarily about preventing the decline of Jaquette, but also creating ecotourism around their parrots and their species. That actually took off, and it took off to such a degree that it created an umbrella and space for all these niche innovation ecotourism businesses. Right? That was not anticipated, but maybe it could have been anticipated, but it was explosive. And it was so explosive that their prior policy package couldn't keep up to the rise in ecotourism and the success in supporting Jaquette. So they had to upgrade it again. Now, I'm going to show you this thing. It's an adapted version, this diagram, of something called the multi-level framework on sustainability transitions. But I think it should be used for societal transitions in general, because in some ways what this says is if you want to get to right-hand impact, where in 1977 we had 100 jaquettes, in 2008 there's 2,000, and I think there's 4,200 now. Whatever your impact is, you have to do the following. We have to work at multiple levels of change that are mutually reinforcing over time. Does that make sense? They had to pay attention to the rise in ecotourism. They had to adapt because their original policy push was a failure. They worked like crazy on an identity strategy with different constituencies, and these things were mutually reinforcing. And so multiple scales mutually reinforcing over time. If you want to get right-hand side impact, you have to do the left-hand side game of working across scales over time. I'm going to keep going with this because there's more implications of this. In Surrey, British Columbia, which is an edge city to Vancouver, the Lower Mainline north of Seattle, etc. In 2006, a group of people wanted to end homelessness and decided that was too ambitious. So they wanted to reduce the number of homeless day laborers because they just had a survey that showed that there was 250 people in Surrey, British Columbia, of about 600,000 people who were working, but couldn't get in, didn't have homes. And so what they said is they employed a systems change strategy. We talked a little bit about strategies, which actually was guided by two principles. Zoom in to get a worm's eye view and insight and empathy, what it was like to be homeless in Surrey and why, and zoom out to address the systems that reproduced that problem in the first place. So the first thing they did is they followed homeless day laborers, and it learned that most of them were working at construction sites. The city was booming in the evenings doing cleanup on construction sites so that when the workers came the next day, they had a clean work site. I did that during university, so I know what that job is like. And they found out that when they left that site, they would go to shelters and shelters would not let them in. Why? For two reasons. A, it was late and they shut their days earlier, and they wanted as a demonstration of vulnerability or proof that you deserve access to these services, proof that you were receiving social assistance or welfare in other people's language. Well, that might have been appropriate 50 or 60 years ago, but 1 out of 2 Canadians, at least, who are poor now are actually working. So the nature of poverty have changed. So those measures, those regulations were best past due date. They were dated. So they brought the shelters together and they said, hey, listen, would you change your patterns here? And the shelter said, sure, we'll do that. In one meeting, they changed 2 regulations, so at least homeless day laborers were getting into the shelters at night. Then they keep peeling away the onion, which is what you kind of do with complex issues. And the next thing they discover is homeless day laborers are working on these construction sites, and the temp agencies who employ them are making 18 bucks an hour. This was 2006. That's not much now. And the employees themselves were making 9 bucks, a 50% cut. Now it's predatory, isn't it? Well, so we brought the groups together again, and I was at that meeting, and we tried to do the same thing we did with the shelters, but the businesses, the temp agencies said, hey, we're going to show you our business book. So we got evidence. We learned something about the system, and here's what we discovered. Not only was it a predatory business, it's a crappy business. It is predatory. They take 50% of the wages, and it's crappy because they barely make, their business model barely survives even doing that. Right? So what we did was we said, well, we can't actually reform them. What we did, or the group did, is they went directly to the construction companies and the government providers and the nonprofit providers and said, we're already providing employment services for some of these people. Would you provide your temporary work, not through a business intermediary, through a nonprofit intermediary, directly with the services, thereby cutting out the 50%, the 50% fee. 75% of the business moved over to nonprofits. So what happened immediately within a couple of months? They get double the wages. Boom, the numbers go down. Not entirely because it's more than those wages, but the numbers went down. But then when you intervene into a complex system, it intervenes back at you. And we actually discovered that we created a solution that had a problem. And the problem was that homeless day laborers, the construction companies wanted to pay automatic deposit. Well, if you're a homeless day laborer, you can't get automatic deposit because you don't probably have a bank account. And why don't you have a bank account? Because you need an address. It's a lot of you work in this area, you know this. And so we brought the big banks together, and Canada has a very conservative banking system. We have 5 or 6 really big banks that don't tend to go under. They're highly regulated, but they're incredibly conservative. So they wouldn't do anything about this. They told us we'd like to do it, but the head offices in Montreal and Toronto won't let us do it. So we went to the local credit unions who created a network of them, including Van City Credit Union, a bunch of pilots that began to be sustained and scaled, affordable financial services for the working poor. Now, what happens here is I could keep going with the story, and it goes on and on and on, but it has some of the same dynamics. And it actually continued. There's a whole new chapter around housing first reform across the region. And now there's a new chapter after that. This literally is working across scales iteratively over time. And in this case, a strategy emerged through a process of trial and error, however, working across scale. There's no way they couldn't do this without a combination of pilots and models and practice changes while they're trying to nudge and shift the systems in which old practices are unfolding. So the last one I'm actually not going to spend time on because I do want to move on to some other things, but this is payday lending in Alberta. Many of you know that if you do get payday lending financial services, people like to go there because they can get their money fast, right? And they can get money without explaining everything about everything to people and demonstrating that they have assets to back it up. But of course, it's also predatory. In fact, 600% interest rates on payday loans in Alberta at one point. So a group in Calgary, oops. Oh, actually, I think I hid my screen, everyone. So just to let you know, it looks something like this, except there's a lot more boxes and a lot more experiments involved. And they also had to work across the 10-year period over time, and their success was dynamic. They did such good public policy and systems reform that the number of payday lenders went from 210 to 135 in Alberta. Alberta now has the lowest payday lending rates in Canada, maybe North America, and they saved roughly $260 million in predatory payments, high interest loan payments, right? So success is possible, but anything on the right, homelessness, payday lending, family care, saving parents, requires mutually reinforcing activities across scales over time. And that's really the key point of this diagram. Just remember the diagram. You have to work across scales, which means you're constantly zooming in and zooming out. What are we doing? What else is going on? What needs to be done? And therefore, what might we do? Maybe we don't do policy change now because we have to build awareness. Or while we're building an awareness, start to do some demonstration projects, etc. You only know that through a process of zooming in and zooming out. You are unavoidably in a game of constant adaptation. This is not a good place for control freaks. Plan the work and work the plan, right? If you like Mozart, learn to like jazz instead. This is really about adaptive work. And many of you know that already. And finally, this is the big point that we're going to come back to at the end. When you're doing systems change work, Erin, you hinted at this, you are unavoidably only able to do one chapter at a time. All of those groups had people working on different projects for 2, 3, 5 years. Some of them stayed the whole time, but every one of them was a chapter. They said, what can we do right now to move this in a roughly right, directionally correct direction? And how do we make enough momentum and awareness and systems change and demonstrations to allow the next group to take up the baton and to do an even better job? Because very few people saw the entire change initiative. It lasts too long. There's too many things going on, but they do try and focus on contributing to 1 or 2 great chapters at a time within their zone of influence. That is their mission, not to complete the book, the volume of change, to help contribute to a great chapter of change that scaffolds for other chapters. Now, with that in mind, I want to broaden the understanding of how to contribute to a chapter. I just finished reading these 4 books, in fact, many, many more books, but these 4 books were interesting because all of them said, here's what you need for transformational change, systems change. And all of them said something very, very different. Tempered Radicals is about how do you work in conservative institutions to make change without getting fired, right? It's a pretty cool phrase. I'm a radical, but I got to be tempered. How do you take small wins, make learning moments, scale stuff? It's a very nuanced, subtle game that punishes verbosity, noise, explicit and visible disruption, right? So it's a terrific book. And I read this and I went, this is awesome. How can one not take lessons from this? Then I read another book called The Neutrality Trap, who's got the best inside cover ever, and says, if you seek premature compromise and avoid disruption, you will end up perpetuating the systems that cause harm in the first place. Your job is to widen the conflict while keeping connections open, and you push conflict and you push awareness, and you'd say, this is unacceptable. You have to do it in the right way to not alienate people and create unnecessary polarization. But this says almost the opposite of tempered radicals. And I thought, well, this is a pretty good book. Then I read the next book. I'm making it up because I didn't read them in these orders, but the next book is about scaling your social innovation. And a lot of people talk about innovation, but this is terrific because Alan Mansky says, if you want to talk about innovation, widen your gaze about who the innovators are. You have disruptive innovators who provide alternatives to the status quo, but guess what? They can't do anything without bridgers and receptors. Bridging innovators are people on the inside of systems who are receptors who will take those ideas and maybe adjust them a little bit, but try and make them scaled and mainstream. Bridges are the people who actually kind of like cultural interpreters. They know everyone, they have lots of relationships, and they're just trying to connect the dots and untie the knots between everyone to make the process go. And what I like about this is it doesn't diminish or trivialize the role of disruptors, but it broadens our gaze about how much work we have and how much work there is to do and how many roles are required to make even innovation good. Tempered radicals and hard critics push the systems to change. It creates space for innovators to make change. Those are different roles. Finally, the hospice worker is a great role. The hospice worker is, how do you let down a current system in a way that is gentle and creates conditions for renewal without it blowing a tire or creating unnecessary resistance and disruption? How do you let it go in a way where we also keep the best of the old system while creating conditions for the new system? I do a lot of this stuff in environmental change work. We need hospice workers too. So this is a take on Meg Wheatley's two-loop theory. There's lots of versions on this, but I kind of like this one. There's a whole bunch of work around pushing and nudging and working within the current system. And there's a whole bunch of work around developing options and encouraging wider spread adoption of innovative ideas to create a new system. And I've just captured some of the roles in those books. You probably have many, many more roles that you would attach to this, right? We need, I used to do a lot in the world of collective impact. I don't like that term anymore. And we spent 10 years doing it, not because it's not important, but it's not big enough. We actually want cumulative impact, not collective impact. It's very hard to get every one of these roles on the page in a meeting doing a theory of change. What we need to do is zoom on going, what's all going on? And do we need to be powerful critics? Do we need disruption? Do we need a bit of hospice worker? And you don't have to be in the same room all the time, but you should be looking laterally to see what else is going on and say, what's the best contribution we can make? Why? It takes multiple roles to change systems. They should be mutually reinforcing. And if we're too rigid in our role and our own theory of change, it can actually create unproductive outcomes. When does a hospice worker and a tempered radical become complicit in perpetuating a system that should change? And when does a strong critic and generate resistance and polarization where none are necessary? I've been in situations going, hey, take it down. We're all sort of in the same zone. You're making too many points too hard. We can't move forward. So again, more zooming in and zooming out with a broader understanding of roles. Here's my last point. I think I'm on time. The enough versus feasible paradox is a kind of a standard challenge in all systems change that Thomas Homer Dixon has described more fully in his book called Commanding Hope, which is mostly about climate change. So we know that we have to work across multiple scales over time, and we know that we need multiple roles to do it. So you should choose your role and your contribution to change wisely. The enough versus feasible paradox says almost all of us who want change have to deal with this paradox. And on the one hand, the actions that are feasible in our context in order to engage people and generate momentum and demonstrate that change is possible, we have to take actions that are feasible, right? You can't say let's infeasible, let's do it. You have to say it's got to be feasible. On the other hand, a lot of these actions are not enough to make the scale and change of work that we require. And the challenge is, what actions can we take and how can we act in a way that is both feasible in our current context and makes the greatest contribution to accelerating and amplifying a systems change or transformation process? We have to embrace both feasible in a way that creates the conditions for something more. Now, I've got a little framework that you can look at. It's a derivative. It's based on 3 horizons or Steve Waddell's work on 3 orders of change. which says when you're talking about change, you could do a real quick self-assessment. Anyone interested in incremental change? Same game, same rules. Let's make systems improvements in a way that doesn't fundamentally challenge those systems. Does that make sense? You can make improvements. I mean, and they may not be huge, but sometimes they're big. I know I worked when we did poverty reduction work, people who were trying to improve their access to benefits, right? Income support benefits. You know what? There was a million little micro threads that created problems. We didn't have to restructure anything. Can you get it inserted in your tax form? How come you have to have an ID number? There was all these tiny little things that were an enormous pain in the ass that when we got rid of them, improved income support and didn't require any kind of revolution. Thank you very much. Right? Or any legislation. It was a whole bunch of administrivia. Reform-oriented innovation is same game, different rules. We accept the communities we work in, the institutions, but we need policy change. We need investment changes. We need changes in decision making. We actually have to reform existing systems, even though they're based on old ideas. Transformative change, different game, different rules. These are coming up with transformative ideas that are of a completely different paradigm. Does that make sense? Like they're just completely new and they may have profound implications for change. I do a lot of stuff in forestry management. Most of the forest responses to these forest fires is a complete reorientation to how we do forestry management on a different paradigm, including everyone giving rivers legal status. Isn't that interesting? Westerners don't do that. Indigenous people do. I work in pretty heavy Indigenous country. That's not transformational for them, but Western Canada, based on settlement patterns that are kind of hardcore industrial capitalism, giving a river legal status is completely mind-blowing. It's based on a different understanding of our relationship to nature. So all three of these, when you're in the change discussions, you're going to be debating these different ambitions of change. And you're also going to feel the urge to do the incremental stuff, even though you got a strong itch to do the transformative. So there's two different ways of doing this, and I'm going to give you a quick case study, then I'm done. One way is to create a mixed portfolio of change initiatives where you're looking at all your work and you're saying, look, mostly we're going to be incremental. We need quick wins. We need to keep momentum going. We need to demonstrate that every human life is precious. We need to see progress. And there's a lot of little things we can do to make a difference, but you deliberately insert into those some more reform-oriented and big swing for the fence ideas that may or may not work out, for sure will meet more resistance, for sure experience a higher risk of snapback. I don't know if you ever made a system change and watch it snap back right to the old pattern 4 years later, maybe because there's a different government in power, but you deliberately create a mixed portfolio. And the second one is more nuanced. You deliberately pick incremental and even reform-oriented initiatives in a way that creates the conditions for a transformational conversation later on. I'm going to give you a quick example of that. In Dauphin, Manitoba, from 1975 to 1979, this is a policy innovation. They experimented with something called the Basic Universal Income Supplement, BUI. And what that was is an experiment to say, don't give people social assistance and make them access programs, give them a living wage. Just give them a living wage. And we followed them for 5 years to find out what happened. So they got just a basic check in the mail, no social assistance, unemployment insurance, or other tagged reforms. At the end of that 5 years, 4 or 5 years, they found out that more kids completed high school in those families. Why? Because they didn't have to leave high school to help pay bills. Number two, there was more small business startups because people had income and the bank could bank on something and they felt more security. Number three, medical services usage went down dramatically because people were healthier. There was a whole splatter of benefits. But a recession hit in 1979 and they took the studies in 150 boxes because I talked to the researcher, buried them in a basement in Ottawa in the federal government, and nothing was heard until 2019, 2020 with COVID. When COVID happened, the transformational disruption, the Basic Universal Income experiment was the most talked about public policy innovation in Canadian history. It got brought back and we were so close to doing it on a massive scale. And why? Because people were open to the idea that maybe this is a good way to go with all these disruptions, because we were doing spotty versions of it with our income supplement programs like you were in the States. And it faded. Trudeau almost did it. Like it wasn't close enough, but it was serious for a while. And what was left on the beach after that is Bill C-22, which is like a basic universal income supplement for persons with disabilities, a broad definition of persons with disabilities, and that did get passed. And it's not as expansive as it needs to be, but all the advocates are saying at least we have a foothold in it because the principle has been accepted. We have legislation, and now we just have to increase the volume of that supplement, which we can do. All Canadian income support programs work that way. Get it in the books and then expand the number. There is no way Bill C-22 is possible without what happened in 1975 to 1979. So if you're working on transformation, it's not feasible. Your job is to create big transformative alternatives, knowing that the time for their adoption, you don't know when they're going to be. But someone has to create transformative opportunities to put them in the pipeline. And so at least some of your portfolio should be that. And you wouldn't judge it in the same way that you would judge an incremental innovation. Does that make sense? They're different games. It's predictable incremental innovation. It's doable, it's feasible. Transformative is not. So you judge it, it's a different game entirely. So I'm really going to leave you now. I think I'll go over to Kirsten with some visuals. I'll try and leave you with visuals. Visual number one with some links is this multi-level framework that we got to work across scales over time in order to get whatever impact we want. Number two, that if you're in the game of systems change, there's lots of roles that you can play. But before you choose what role you should play, you should zoom out and find out what's going on before you zoom in and saying, here are the roles we're going to play, and here's our unique contribution to change. And that whatever change process you use, you're going to deal with this incremental reform transformative urge. And we're saying maybe think about some portfolios and pick a couple initiatives that lean into transformation. So I think the questions we leave you with, and Kirsten, I'll pop it over to you, is which of these ideas, if any, resonate with you most and why?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. And thanks, Erin, as well, for setting the stage. We're actually gonna go into discussion and question and answer. So Mark, I don't know if you want to stop sharing or if you want to
I can, yeah.
Yeah, and we can all see each other's beautiful faces. So that was awesome. You folks can maybe now understand why I love both of these individuals and I love working with them. They push you to think about very complex and challenging things. But I loved, Mark, how you ended with this idea around creating sort of transformational innovation, I think is how you said it. And this idea that what do we want to do right now? Like, what chapter do we want to write? And I feel like that fits really beautifully into the work that we're trying to do right now around building this primary prevention ecosystem, right? How do we sort of build it? What is the chapter we're on so that in the future, the next 50 years, when we're no longer here, we've set the stage, and we've sort of left this work to enter a much higher level of the idea around systems change and systems thinking. So I love that. I thought a lot about some of the work that we're doing now. I want to just let folks, like, are there questions that anyone has or anything they want to share? Mark's question that he left at the end of his slide, what resonates with you most? Are there things that you feel sort of align with some of the work that we're doing right now in our field? And what do we want to explore a little bit more? So y'all can, you can come off of mute and ask anything or share anything that you'd like to share.
I'll jump in. My name is Jenny, and I'm from the Missouri Network Against Child Abuse. And I think what both of the speakers gave me was a sense of relief. I was someone who wrote overwhelmed in the beginning, and hearing the complexities and how some of the things that we're doing fit into systems change just felt like a relief. Like, before I felt like we weren't on the right path, and now this was really reinforcing and helping to see things from all different perspectives. So I just want to thank you all for what you shared.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for sharing that. Well, while we wait for others to kind of percolate or marinate on what they want to ask, I wanted to ask a question to you, Mark and Erin, because I think a lot of our challenges in this work is around philanthropy, and finding funders that actually understand systems change and want to invest and support in systems change. And Erin, I loved the example that you used around the logic model, right? Where a lot of funders ask for logic models, but there's so much more to that picture that we're not including or understanding. And so just wanted to hear maybe quickly from both of you, or any insight that you want to share around how do we really move the philanthropic field or funders to understand systems change and why it's important to invest in systems change?
Go ahead, Erin. I'm happy to go ahead, but you may have preliminary thoughts.
I'll share two. One is, I think, helping to build awareness around the difference between attribution and contribution. That programs have been in this box of kind of this linear, you do something, then you have a direct outcome, and you attribute all of your success to your program. But systems change is more about the contribution. Mark said this in his cumulative impact comment. The contribution of multiple actors, decentralized, taking actions at multiple levels. Like it's the wrong paradigm to think of that kind of like random controlled trial experiment model of seeing change. We have to expand that out. And I think that's the paradigm shift that almost needs to happen first to help funders see that there's a possibility for doing this differently, as well as just kind of the multiple levels of partnership that need to happen in order to actually make progress. So I think there's some like foundational paradigm changes that should be part of our strategy work to shift in funders, because it affects the ecosystem that we're all trying to operate in. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think in what you're asking, what the implication of what you're saying is that we have to get good at awareness building and education, really. Simon Sinek wrote a book called The Infinite Game. I don't know if you've read it. It's really, there's a lot to take from the book, but essentially he makes a distinction between finite games and infinite games. And finite games are like Monopoly, basketball, baseball, etc. You know what the rules are, you know what winning is, and the actors are kind of stable. Infinite games are like everything that you do and we're talking about today. There's a lot of people playing different games, trying to achieve different outcomes with different rules. And what happens is no one really knows what the big game is. And if you're trying to change something like you're trying to change, you have to frame what winning is, or else someone else is going to do it and they're going to default to their preference and the way they know how. Right? They will default to really linear, simple, straightforward stuff. Here's what I think winning is. Our job is to frame what winning and what game we're playing. And that includes things like, Erin, what you did, is to saying, listen, here's the nature of the problem we want to address. We could go at it programmatically, and here's some of the program things that we are asking you to support. And here's what winning looks like in a program. But we're also going to be doing some systems change work. And that is a lot more crazy. Let's talk about some of the examples that you know as a funder, right? Policy change, etc. Hey, drinking and driving, everyone, do you remember how a long time ago that was acceptable? When I was 6 years old, I lived 200 kilometers from Edmonton, 130 miles. And my Polish grandfather, when I asked when I asked him how far was St. Paul, my small town, to Edmonton, he said, oh, it's about 6 beers. Right? That was completely normal in 1973. Completely. It's not normal now. We know what systems change looks like. So you tell people examples. You've seen systems change. Now that you know that's a different game, and that's the game we're playing, and here's our strategy, and here's what we're investing in, and it's unpredictable, it's long term. You describe that game to them. And then in order to actually shrink the change and make people not so neurotic about it, you'd say, and in order to do that, we're going to offer you a mixed portfolio. We got some programmatic, we got some systemic, we got some incremental, we got some, but we're asking you to appreciate that those have to be managed and evaluated differently. And also say you probably have some admin practices that are legacy practices, like a logic model. I call a logic model a zombie practice. It shows up no matter what, right? Even if you shoot it, it's coming. It always shows up. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it is. A lot of, particularly when you have a linear program, good, use it. Sometimes it's so horrible, it's not even funny. So the issue is to say, I know you want me to conceptualize what we're doing. Sometimes it's a logic model, sometimes a theory, sometimes it's a strategy. So you'd say, I know you have legacy practices. Let's understand why you have them and work around them. A lot of people just can't help themselves. They go, I just assume it's a logic model. And you go, well, no, you need to know what we're trying to achieve and how it may not be a logic model. So you frame winning and what your strategy is. You give a mixed portfolio so they can get a little bit of something that's tangible and immediate. And then you say, I'm willing to work with you around legacy practices that may not support this.
Love that. And sometimes you have to play the game, right? So I love the idea around like the logic model and the zombie practice, right? Sometimes you just got to do it. But I think it's also our responsibility, collective responsibility, to push the envelope as well. And so I like the idea of a mixed portfolio. I think that's a great strategy.
And Jennifer, just to build on that, even if you talk about the logic model, we're just using that as an example.
Yeah.
And we go, you know what? It's kind of baked. It's kind of goofy.
Right.
It's not really working, but we don't have an alternative. So can we agree, nudge, nudge, wink, wink? We'll stuff this complexity into a logic model, but let's not pretend. We all know what's going on. It's a credentialized mechanical process whose purpose is to trigger the release of a check. So we'll do it for credentialized reasons, but in this case, let's say that we're not going to get overly serious about it. So sometimes you have to make a nudge, nudge, wink, wink agreement to sustain a zombie practice, fully understanding why it's not as important as someone might think.
Yeah. Well, and there's other practices that people have tried across the world that are better than the zombie logic model practices that we could like show. So this is a great book that provides a lot of those examples. And there's some people really working to bring systems thinking into evaluation, and others internationally that have really great examples that can push back against, well, what else are we going to use if not a logic model? Well, here's like 15 ideas that are better than just the baked in logic model. So it's being equipped with those so that we can bring them on.
Yes.
Thank you. That was awesome. Any other questions or reflections, comments?
I think Linda brought up an interesting point in the chat about basically what I'm taking from some of her comments is how can we create some alignment across all these different states who have different contexts, different situations, to have that cumulative impact. I think Mark was talking about where we have some shared goals. There's different ways to achieve that goal, but there's some sort of shared momentum towards having some aligned action across states. I think that's a really fascinating idea and something that, you know, like this network can explore what that might look like, and how to adapt and change that over time, given what is going to happen. I mean, the world could look very different after November. There's a bunch of ways that things can go, you know, and so just being very adaptive. But I love this idea of how can we leverage the power across multiple states to push for some shared things that will benefit everyone's work, related to the theory of change.
Yeah, I agree, Erin. I think that's what I love one of the things I love about the theory of change. There's many things, and I'm biased, that I love about the theory of change, but this idea that we've created some collective action and urgency and responsibility around a shared set of goals, as well as strategies and aspirational outcomes, and what we need in terms of building a primary prevention ecosystem. And so really moving, and that's, part of the beginning of our chapter, right? Having this theory of change that we can all rally around, and then what are the pieces that are important for us to move on together collectively.
Mhm.
So I think that's the beauty of what we created over the last couple of years, to have that shared language and collective action.
Yeah.
Other things that folks want to reflect on, or questions or comments? We're coming coming close to the end here. So we could probably take one more if somebody has one. Question or comment.
I can add a point if there's space.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Mark, and then we can wrap up.
One of the things that I'm learning more about, and it's probably best captured in that two loop diagram, the middle one, about multiple roles, is the importance of listening to people you don't agree with, like, or trust. And the reason I'm learning that more in the climate change initiative work that I'm doing, but I think it's also social change work as well. Not that climate change is not social change, but I'm working on the Canada Plastics Pact, trying to dramatically reduce the volume of plastics that are used in the world, and something on energy transition in an oil and gas economy. And people who are resistant to it, either for ideological reasons or because they're incumbents and they have a vested interest in the status quo, also sometimes say things that are useful. So I learned a lot about why we have plastics in the first place and what plastics were originally developed to avoid as other problematic environmental practices. And so I'm less ideological about getting rid of them at all costs. I kind of go, oh, I see why we started them. If we get rid of them, we're going to have some of these same problems. So we slow down a little bit about being so captured by that solution set. And from a guy who's pretty left to center on environment, I'm not such a big fan of electrical vehicles anymore. Why? I'm not against them. It's just they're really not going to have the impact that we think they're going to have. They create their whole host of problems. And the fundamental problem is our ambitions around transportation are too high. Individual transportation, we simply have too many cars, period. We build crappy cities, so it's a problem. So EV is not just a better solution to rapacious consumption of cars. I would not have thought those unless we were hard pressed by people who we didn't agree with, like, or trust, telling us those things, and we were in a container where we weren't all lizard brained anxious about it. So I'm really appreciative of, in the right circumstances, listening to people with differing opinions.
I love that, Mark. I think that's a great way to end this session. I will say, when we were we gathered feedback and input from over 1,700 people as part of our adaptive strategy process and building the theory of change, and it was important for us to listen to those folks as well, that what did you say, like, listen to, or agree with, or
Yeah, agree with, like, or trust.
Agree with, like, or trust. And we thought that was so critical as well, when we're building something that we all want people to be a part of. And so I love that. So I want to just say thank you again, Mark. It's so great to see you and be in your space again. Erin, as always, for just incredible information, experience, and wisdom. Really appreciate you sharing that, and making, or at least trying to make, systems change, complex thinking somewhat easy for us to understand. And so appreciate that. I also want to thank all of us, or all of you who joined us today. As we continue to learn together and zoom out. I love that Mark used zooming in and zooming out. As we zoom out and learn more about the things that impact our environments, and what we need in order to work together to build this primary prevention ecosystem across this country so that all kids and families are living a purposeful and happy life with hope for the future. Want you to save the date for our next Zooming Out speaker series. It will be on adaptive leadership, featuring Peter Watson from Casey Family Programs, and that will be held on September 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So thank you all. If you need anything, you know where to look. Reach out to me or Kirsten. We're happy to help in anything or any way you need around the theory of change in our strategy work. So have a great rest of the day, and thank you again for joining us. Take care.
Cheers, bub.